All right, let's begin. It is nice to be here. It really is, and it's nice to learn with everybody. Thank you for joining us, whether in person here, online, on Zoom, on Facebook, on podcast, on YouTube, all the many ways in which you can join this class. And it's just so wonderful to have so many learning Torah with us. We've begun this section of Talmud last time, and we've now done two sessions actually on this piece of Talmud, and we'll continue on hopefully. But let's do some review, especially for those who are joining us today. I don't think it's going to be too complicated to catch up. And really, it's been a beautiful piece of Talmud, and it's really helped us to understand, I think, where does the authority of the rabbis come from? There's this idea that rabbis can make rules and make gates around the Torah or fences around the Torah and sort of make extra legal room. If you've ever studied halacha and Talmud, we have laws that their source comes from the Torah. And then there's this whole set of extra laws that come from the rabbis. And of course, we have to observe both of them. But the question I think that comes really is, how far does the power of the rabbis go? Obviously, we have to do what the Torah tells us to, but the rabbis have this power to make extra laws beyond the laws of the Torah. Obviously, though, that shouldn't just be that they can make laws of anything, because that would sort of be too much authority. That would be too much power. In American language, we would say that's not enough checks and balances, right? So where is the check on rabbinic power? And I think trying to understand sort of how far rabbis can go to make extra legislation will also help us understand where the authority of the rabbis come from and what is the whole point of these rabbinic laws that they're trying to make. So that's really our focus for our learning. We started on the Mishnah in Shabbat 11a, which comes after a big sugya, a big discussion that talks about mostly carrying on Shabbat. The beginning in the first chapter of Shabbat really talks about the prohibition of carrying and that you can't carry outside of certain domains of Shabbat. And this Mishnah basically kind of sort of moves the needle a little bit and begins talking about specifically how we prepare before Shabbat for Shabbat. And specifically here, we have a bunch of rabbinic gezerah. We have a bunch of rabbinic decrees that are made that in order to help us prepare for Shabbat. So specifically, it's talked about here is that the tailor needs to not go out with the needle that he uses, obviously, to sew and to do his craft right before Shabbat begins, right? And the reason of this, of course, is that there's a fear that obviously if it was actually Shabbat and he was carrying his needle, that would be a violation of the prohibition on Shabbat to carry on Shabbat, right? Because he's carrying his needle. And similarly, the Mishnah goes on, talks about the scribe and his quill, kind of similar thing. We see that the Mishnah says he can't shake his clothes, he can't read a book by candlelight, and this is going to be a question of whether this is about Erev Shabbat or actual Shabbat. The Gemara will detail that later. I'm not sure we'll actually get to that, but regardless. And so that really is, the Mishnah goes on to other things, but I think at this point in time, that's the most important thing to know about the Mishnah. We're really talking about this law. Just one second. So we're really talking about this law of this gezerah, this decree that said that you can't carry a needle out before Shabbat. And I think it's important for us to know, obviously, the Torah would not prohibit carrying a needle out before Shabbat in general, right? There's nothing wrong with carrying a needle when it's not Shabbat, right? So obviously, this is of rabbinic authority to say one is prohibited to do this even before Shabbat begins. Yeah, Beth.
Where are you? What daf are you on? Because I have Safaria here. I can look it up.
Oh, no, I'm about to put the text on the screen, so
okay.
you'll see it right on the screen. Thank you for reminding me. Actually, I should actually just do that now. All right, hold on one second, everybody, as we share the text on the screen. Okay. Thank you for reminding me, Beth, to share the screen there. I forgot for a second.
Good morning.
Okay. Good morning. Nice to see you. Nice to have you here, Liz, too. And I saw Amy, you came in as well. Thank you for being here online. We were just going over the Mishnah very quickly. And again, the most important information to know here is about this tailor going out with his needle. And specifically, this is a rabbinic decree. Obviously, it's not forbidden to go out on before Shabbat with a needle, but it is certainly on Shabbat. So where does this power come from? that the rabbis were doing this and how far does it proceed. And so we kind of moved on past then. We looked at some of the Rashis here that sort of played with this idea. And really the central thing to learn that we learned from Rashi is specifically that this is a case where they're going out right before Shabbat begins, and when the Gemara, the Mishnah here says Shema Yishkach and say, and says lest he forgot and go out. It's interesting the Mishnah leaves out what he specifically forgot, and at least according to Rashi's understanding of the sugya, Rashi seems to be saying that what he forgets is that he forgets that he was carrying the needle. And then Shabbat begins, and he walks out thinking he has nothing on him, and he forgets that the needle's on him, therefore violating for a prohibition of carrying on Shabbat. And so in order to prevent this, the rabbi said you need to remove everything from your pockets and everything like this before Shabbat begins to make sure that you don't forget, to give yourself some wiggle room, right? And so that seems to make sense, and that seems to be what Rashi says. We learned last week, though, from this Tosafot that we went through, which remember, Tosafot are is the commentary on the other side of the page of the Talmud, written by the grandchildren of Rashi. And this Tosafot specifically suggests that actually a different solution to this problem of what are we forgetting than Rashi does. And this often happens where the Tosafot will sort of disagree with Rashi and disagree. And they disagree for a specific reason. What's the problem with Rashi's solution according to Tosafot? Well, the problem is that specifically all Shabbat labor needs to be what's called malacha machshevet. It needs to be intentional labor, meaning you needed to mean to do the prohibition. And if you don't mean to do the prohibition and you do it on mistake, you're actually not violating the Torah, right? The Torah, you only can actually violate a Torah prohibition when you do the action or the prohibited action on purpose, not on purpose just because it was prohibited, but that you really meant to do the action, whether it was permitted or not. So, for example, in this case, you really meant to bring the needle out into a different reshut or a different domain, right? In this case, at least according to Rashi's interpretation, that's not the case, right? When the person leaves their house, they didn't mean to bring the needle out. They didn't even realize the needle was on them, according to Rashi's understanding. If this be the case, then what Tosafot notes specifically is that this case is actually a breaking of rabbinic origin. The rabbis are what extended this to say, even if you didn't mean to do the permitted action, you should work to prevent to not do those things, even though you're not going to break the Torah if you didn't mean to. Because again, if you get used to doing things on mistake, you can understand how your mind might rationalize saying, well, if a prohibition happens on mistake, I don't need to worry about it. No, the rabbis saying you need to worry about that too. So the rabbis actually extended the laws of Shabbat to include violating prohibitions on mistake, right, or without meaning to. Now, that violation that one would have done, according to this, would not be a Torah violation. So when we violate Shabbat and violate a Torah prohibition, if there are two witnesses, right, it's the death penalty, and if it was done on purpose, so basically there's an understanding then. But if again, if there aren't witnesses, right, and someone just does this, right, there might be karet, there might be some spiritual punishment. But if there's a violation of a rabbinic law and not a Torah law, what we get is 40 lashes, right? And it's really a punishment about not listening to the rabbis, right? There's a mitzvah in the Torah that specifically says that gives the rabbis the authority to make extrajudicial laws or extra Torah laws to protect the Jewish people. But our punishment for doing this or breaking the laws of the rabbi is 40 lashes, and the rabbis call this a makat mardut, right? Lashings of a rebellion, because what are you rebelling against? The authority of the rabbis, right? It's just really to keep people in line. It's not the origin, so it's a different punishment. And of course, we don't do these punishments anymore. Probably shouldn't, but I think it's important because it helps us differentiate the stringency or how serious the violation is. It helps us classify how judicial law is actually working or how Jewish law is actually working. So Tosafot says that actually taking out the needle on Shabbat, in this case, if we followed Rashi's interpretation, would only be the breaking of a rabbinic prohibition, right? And so what's the problem with it? What's the problem that Tosafot has with this? Well, Tosafot introduces us this interesting concept that this would then be considered a gezerah upon a gezerah. It would be a decree upon a decree. And according to Rabbah, as we'll see in the sugi as it continues, and sometimes what makes Tosafot hard is sometimes they mention things that you haven't read yet in the sugi yet, but we're going to read it soon, is that Rabbah at least thinks, and Rabbah was an Amora, thinks that the rabbis have no ability to make a gezerah upon a gezerah, right? So the first gezerah, right, that the rabbis make, or the first decree the rabbis make, is that one cannot even do unintentional labor on Shabbat. So that's the first rabbinic extension of the law. But now, if we follow Rashi, the rabbis are extending it a second gezerah by saying, even before Shabbat, you can't carry this needle. So you understand what it means by a gezerah upon a gezerah, right? According to Rashi's understanding of the Mishnah, the Tosafot criticizes that by saying what the Mishnah would then be saying is that the rabbis are doing is making a decree upon a decree. And that's not allowed according to Rabbah. Rabbah says that the rabbis can only make an extrajudicial decree upon a Torah law itself. By extending that and saying, no, the rabbis can make a decree upon a decree, right? They say that's extending their authority too far. Right. So this might sound very complicated. I'm using a lot of Hebrew words. I'm using a lot of things. Let me explain it in a way that might make sense. Right. American law requires us to build a fence around a pool. OK. Right. So if you have a pool in your backyard, you got to build a fence. Right. And the reason that you have to build a fence is because it's not that, God forbid, you don't have a fence around your pool. The thing that the American government and the American people are worried about is that a child or someone who can't swim will fall into the water, right? Very important, right? Now, if some local authority came and said, not only do you have to put, your a fence around the pool in order to protect you from even getting near the fence, you have to actually put a fence around your entire house because you happen to have a pool there. So you need a second fence. Right? According to the rabbis, they would say that's an extra, that is one step too far. That is way too stringent, that you have no right to do that. Of course, American law is different. Who knows what local can do, but they would say that's too stringent. That's going too far, and that you're extending your authority too much. That's what we mean here by a fence around a fence. I'm giving you a quite literal example. Do you understand? Does that make sense to everybody? Please tell me if it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yep.
Good, wonderful. So that's kind of what we learned last time. And I really thought this concept was interesting because it shows that all rabbinic decrees and rabbinic protections and extra Torah laws have to be made in order to directly protect a person from violating a Torah mitzvah. The rabbis have no right to make laws to protect their laws that they make, right? You would think, okay, well, I want everyone to follow this law. I want them to be really serious about it. That I made. So therefore, I'm going to make an extra law around it to make sure that everyone needs to follow it. It's not the case, right? That's actually not true according to the Torah. And I think what that does is keep the rabbis focused of what should they really care about? Should they care about their own authority, or should they care more about to make sure that people aren't violating laws of the Torah that actually God revealed and God commanded? Make sense so far? So that's kind of where we are with the Mishnah right now. We actually haven't even made it into the Gemara yet. So let's get into the Gemara. So I'm going to go down the page here, and we're now in the Gemara. On the sheet, it seems like if you have the paper sheet, it is on the 1, 2, 3, 4th page on the bottom. So the Gemara starts like this. It says, let me make sure it's visible on the screen here. Okay. Tanan Hatan. It's taught in the Mishnah there. So in a separate Mishnah in a different place, it's taught this Mishnah. And we know that by the way, the Hebrew says Tanan. Tanan in Aramaic means it is taught, but it specifically means it is taught in a Mishnah. So elsewhere in the Mishnah it says this. Now remember, if the Gemara is bringing up a Mishnah from somewhere else, the Gemara's concern is going to be does this Mishnah match up to this other Mishnah, right? It's all one Mishnah altogether. All the rulings of the Mishnah have to line up and have to be able to work together. So this is the first Mishnah the rabbis bring up in the Talmud. And it says, Tananatam, Lo ya'amod adam b'reshut ha'yachid, v'yishteh b'reshut ha'rabim. B'reshut ha'rabim v'yishteh b'reshut ha'yachid. So we translate that as, we learned in the Mishnah there, a person may not stand in the private domain, Reshut ha'yachid, and drink water located in the public domain, or vice versa. Stand in the public domain and drink water in the private domain. So what are we actually talking about? What is the situation here, right? Can anyone describe for me the situation? What are we talking about? Anyone who's on our Zoom today or in person can tell us what is the situation the Gemara is describing?
I think that you can't carry in the public domain. And so you can't, even if you're standing in private domain, you're still reaching your hand out, you're carrying in the public domain to drink water. So you're like trying to find a workaround so that you can take something, but you have to be fully in private domain to carry anything. That's what I take from it.
Okay, that's definitely a possibility. I like that. Anybody else?
Would this public domain, would this not be not an eruv, but would be
Exactly.
yeah.
Right? Exactly. Because when you have an eruv around something, it is a private domain, right? Make sense so far? Okay.
Yes.
So let's take a look at it, right? A person standing in a private domain. Imagine they're standing in the private domain, and there's some water. There's either a water fountain. I imagine a water fountain. Not that they had water fountains back then, or some kind of fountain or something like that, or river body, that water body in which to drink from. And what the person wants to do, right, is lean over and drink the water that is in the domain. Now, is that in itself is that prohibited? Right. Let's go back to I'm seeing you shake your head.
I don't think you can drink water.
Right. The drinking water obviously is fine on Shabbat. Right now, what is the Torah violation we're worried about here? Right. And I think this is always important when studying Hilchot Shabbat, when studying the laws of Shabbat. It's really important to remember the malacha we're talking about. What actually is forbidden on Shabbat here? Carrying, right? And what that means is carrying an object from one domain to the other domain. So any object in which crosses from a public domain into a private domain, or a private domain into a public domain, would be the breaking of a Torah prohibition, right? If you did it on purpose, right? Now, imagine the case where you're leaning over. So what you're doing in this case, you're in the private domain and you're leaning over the boundary in order to drink the water. Now, are you actually moving anything into the private domain? If you do that?
No.
No, right? You're drinking the water.
You're not carrying anything. Yeah.
Your mouth is in the public domain. You're drinking the water. Either you're bending down to drink it from a pool or a water fountain or something like that. And then you come back and then you bend back and you stand back. And now you're in the private domain. You haven't carried anything, right? You have nothing in your pocket. Seems like a permitted action, right? So what's the worry here? What's the problem? Yeah, do you have a question or do you want to ask that question?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I thought you can't carry anything in a public domain. So could you be in a public domain, carry something to somewhere else in a public domain as long as you don't cross back into a private domain?
It's a really great question. So you actually can only carry in a public domain 6 feet.
Okay.
So
you can't.
For a moat.
So you could be in a public domain, take a drink of water, put it right back down, and that's okay.
That would be perfectly okay. As long as you stay within 6 feet, which the rabbis considered as their personal space, right? You have, even in the Reshut HaRabim, and this is a very good thing, by the way, if you really want to be careful about carrying and you really need to carry something somewhere, and there's a real problem, there are some authorities who say the way to handle that is actually to pick up an object and then move it 3 feet or so, 4 feet, then put it down again, and then pick it up again, and then it's obviously annoying, really annoying to do that, but that's the way, in case there's an emergency, you can sort of loophole around this law a little. But that really is the problem. So the answer, of course, is that there is no problem with doing this according to a Torah law. So this is another case here. If the Mishnah here is saying, Mishnah quoted by the Gemara, is saying here that one may not do this, what is this? Is this a Torah rule or is this a rabbi rule?
That would be rabbinic.
Good. It's a rabbinic rule. Exactly. And Josh said at the same time, a rabbi rule, right? Because it's not actually forbidden by the Torah, but the rabbis feel like there must be some danger here in breaking Torah law. Now it's up to us to figure out sort of what is the concern here? What is the concern that the rabbis are worried about? Can anyone guess?
I think they're concerned that somebody's going to get a flask and, they're going to interpret it that, oh, it's fine to have water from the public domain, and they're going to end up getting that.
Perfect. Exactly, Liz. Thank you. That was beautiful. What really, really good catch there. So that's exactly what the rabbis are concerned about, right? Think about how you drink, right? So maybe you're going to get a cup or something like that, and you're going to put the cup under the water. And you're going to say to yourself, "Oh, I know there's a problem. I'm going to keep the cup. I know there's. Let's say, just to make this very simple, let's say the cup is located already in the water fountain, right? And you use the cup to drink, and you're saying, well, don't worry, I'm going to use the cup to drink, but I'm going to put it right down back in the public domain. I'm not going to bring it back in. What's going to happen? You drink a lot of water. You sort of forget, oh, this water's so good. What happens? And then you lean back and you have the cup in your hand. And what's going to happen?
Torah prohibition.
Torah prohibition. Right? What is the Torah prohibition that we're breaking?
Public to private domain.
Public to private domain. We're carrying a vessel, right? So that's the Torah prohibition that the rabbis are concerned about, that they're looking to distance you from this gezerah, in this decree. The Gemara continues. However, the Mishnah here actually gives a caveat. However, if he introduced his head and most of his body into the place where the water that he is drinking is located, there is no room for concern, and it is permitted. And then it ends with this weird thing we'll get to at the end. We'll get to after this, and the Gemara certainly will be concerned about. And the same is true in the wine press, the gat. Okay? We're going to get to the wine press in a second. The Gemara is actually, Rashi here says, Mivor La'il, that this is explained in the Gemara. So don't worry if you don't understand it right now, the wine press thing, and we will get to that. But let's look at this first part. Why do you think, what is the exception the rabbis make? Can anyone parse this out for us? What is the rabbi saying here in Mishnah?
I think if you introduce most of your body into the public domain to drink, it's much less likely you're like leaning over something. So it's much less likely you would accidentally stand up and bring it back.
Right, exactly. Right. So if you put the majority of your body into this place, there's much less a chance that you're going to bring the thing back than if you just like put your head in or something like that. The rabbis are seeming to make sort of now. I think this is sort of. Do you think this is a good point? Do you think this is a good exception? If they're really concerned about this, do you think this is a good exception or a bad exception? Think about it. It's a very pragmatic question.
I mean, to me, it seems kind of weak because if they were really worried about it, then you just create this very simple exception. So to me, it seems like you're really not that worried about it.
Exactly, right? I think, Josh, you make a really great point. Think about putting your head in somewhere. Okay, I can see there's maybe a little bit, it's uncomfortable to just put my head in. Maybe there's more of a chance of me taking the vessel out. But even if I put my whole body in and my feet, remember, have to be in the other domain, and I bend my whole entire body over, right? That's uncomfortable too. And I'm going to want to also still go like this and then be in danger of bringing the cup back in. So I think the rabbis are making an exception, right? An important exception. It's an exception that has some pragmatic reasoning behind it, but it seems like a stretch, right? Now, why might the rabbis be stretching the law with this exception? What do you think? Well, think about it. Think about it pragmatically. What are the values of the rabbi? Water's important, exactly. If you need to drink water, you need to drink water. Now, obviously, if you're going to die, you can break any violation. If you're literally, starving, or dying of thirst, obviously you can break any Torah law in order to save yourself. Now, we all know, though, some of us who have not, died of thirst from not being able to drink, when we need water, we still need water, right? You can feel sick, you can feel not good, you really need water. Obviously, depriving people of water is not a good thing to do. So I think the rabbis are probably stretching the law a little bit because they don't want someone to be in a situation where like the water is like right outside the public domain, but they can't have it because of a rabbinic law. Right? Obviously, if the rabbis make laws in which the people can't stand by, because imagine if you're a person and you're trying to follow rabbinic law and you're really, really thirsty and you see the water right outside and you know you can lean right over and have a drink of it and still follow all of Torah law, but you know there's this rabbinic law that's preventing you from doing that, right? Who are you going to be angry at? Not the Torah. Torah is logical. The rabbis are, because of offense, are preventing you from drinking water, okay? So that's really bad, right? And the rabbis, of course, are afraid that people are not going to be able to hold by this law. And this is something the rabbis are always concerned about. Are they going to make a gezerah? Are they going to make a decree that is too much to bear for the people? And I think what that does, I really want to isolate this idea because I think it adds another value to our conversation, right? We already have bumped into the value that the loci of the authority or the source of the authority of where the rabbis are getting their power from is specifically from the Torah. They can make decrees, extra legal decrees, but only when that directly protects a Torah violation or some kind of Torah law. Now we have a different data point. We have another value that the Gemara seems to be adding in here, which is the case of, are the people going to be able to hold by this rabbinic decree? Are they going to laugh at the rabbis and say, that's ridiculous, you're making my life way too hard, right? Now, the rabbis do make our lives harder sometimes in order to protect Torah, but they can't make our lives too hard because people then will start rebelling, right? Think about any leader who's making laws. Make sense so far? So again, I think also this, yes, yeah. Wonderful. Any questions on this so far?
No, I think you're doing a good job.
Good, wonderful. So I think this is really important because it doesn't just point to show rabbinic authority. I think it shows what the Torah is really concerned about. What is Judaism and what should Judaism look like? What should Jewish law, what should Shabbat look like, right? It really should be centered around the Torah, right? And what the Torah says. And we should really be concerned as a Jewish community about centered around what the Torah actually prohibits and doesn't. But to also understand that when we're making these extra laws, they have to be laws that people can hold by. Okay, with Torah laws, we have to move our lives around, shape everything, and clean out our whole entire house for Pesach and all this stuff, crazy stuff we do for the Torah. But for rabbinic laws, it should not make our lives bitter. It should not make our lives so much more difficult. Unless it's, of course, absolutely necessary, and you're definitely going to violate the Torah if you do that, right? Which is the case where that's not the case. Right. And I think that if I'm reading between the lines, I would say that is one of the reasons here why the rabbis are willing to make this kind of bogus exception, right? This kind of vacuous exception here somewhat. Does that make sense so far? Good. All right, let's keep going. So, and by the way, I didn't get this out of nothing. How did I understand? If I'm learning Gemara, right, how did I learn this? I learned this from Rashi. And I just want you to understand, I'm not some superhuman being who just guess what the rabbis want to say. I learned this idea, this from Rashi. Rashi kind of fills in the details. He says, and I'm sorry, I didn't translate this Rashi, although now I'm going to provide translations from now on, because I realize if you just cut and copy a text into ChatGPT, immediately it translates it. So I will have this from now. This is from a couple of weeks ago when I said this shia. And Rashi specifically says, right? That what Rashi is explaining was what the rabbis are worried about, which we already explained, is that when you're in the private domain and you might extend your mouth and head into the Reshut Rabim, into the public domain, lachoz kli, to grab a cup or a vessel of some sort, lishtot, and to drink. And then they made a gezerah, right, a decree, lest Shema Yotzi Kli, lest one brings the vessel outside of the Reshut Rabim, Elav, to himself, into the Reshut Yichid, into the private domain, Benimsa, and then you would find yourself in that case, Mitchaya Chatat, right? You'd have to bring a Chatat because you mistakenly broke a Torah violation. Okay, makes sense so far? Right? Now, important, right? This is another case where we find, and the rabbis are often do this, they set up parallel cases. Is this a parallel? How is this a parallel case to our Mishnah? Can anyone explain that? How is this a parallel case to our Mishnah?
Well, the Mishnah was about the tailor who forgot that he had a needle on him, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's forgetting.
Right. You might forget that you have the vessel, you're drinking or whatever, and you're going to bring it back into the private domain. It's a case of a mistake, right? You might make a mistake, and you might mistakenly bring the cup back. Now, in some ways, this is different, right? You can imagine when you're holding the object in your hand, and at some point in the Gemara, they're going to say either the needle was in the tailor's shirt, which we'll discuss in a little bit, or it was in their pocket, right? That's in some ways one is not actually meaning to do an action if one moves from one domain to the other with that thing in their hand, right? But even when we take a vessel, right, if we take a vessel from the outside to the inside with our hands, right, you don't keep that vessel in your pocket if you're drinking from it, you have it in your hand, right? Even if the mistake and what you're forgetting, right, is the fact that it's not permitted to do this. You're not forgetting that you're doing it, right? When you bring the cup into the private domain, you know that you're bringing the cup. No one's saying the person is not cognizant that they're bringing the cup or they forgot that the cup is in their hand. The forgetting part is really that it's Shabbos, right? That you're doing something that's forbidden at the time. So that in some ways is somewhat different than the case of the needle, in which we know that they didn't mean to bring the needle out. It's not that they forgot about Shabbat, but that they brought the needle out. Let's keep going though. Okay, so that's where the Gemara begins. And so the Gemara sort of quotes this interesting parallel Mishnah, right? So far, so good, everybody? Good. Let's continue. So the Gemara continues and asks a question or a dilemma. So he writes, sorry, okay here. Ibayalahu. So which means he asked them. Baya is in Aramaic is same as lishol, to ask, right? In Hebrew. So he asked lahu is lahem in Hebrew, lahu in Aramaic is to them, right? Very confusing if you're a native Hebrew speaker. So he asked them, Carmelit man, what about the case of a Carmelite? Now, we have to go through some background information here. There are 4 different domains that the rabbis create or understand when it comes to territory on Shabbat. And usually these domains are discussed when it comes to carrying on Shabbat. There is a makom. There are 2 really Torah domains. There's the makom, Reshut HaYachid, the private domain, and the Reshut HaRabim, the public domain. The Reshut HaYachid is defined as any area that is fenced in, right? So that there's walls all around it, right? And that it is a certain small size. It has to be a small enough size, or I'm sorry, not a small enough size. It needs to be a big enough. It can't be too small. I mean, it has to be basically big enough for a person to fit in. And that basically is what makes a private domain. There are other complicated details, but we're not going to go into them right now. And what we mean by this basically is private property, but it's more than the American definition of private property, where it belongs to somebody. But it's specifically fenced in, right? So, for example, if I have land and my private property extends by 4 acres, right? And if I don't have a house around it, even though it's my private property, according to the Torah's understanding, it would not be considered a Reshut Yichid or a private domain outside of the walls of your house, right? So that's where I think American law differs definitely from Jewish law here. So that's a private domain. The other Torah domain is the Reshut HaRabim, is the public domain. And the public domain is really defined as public space, right? But it's specifically public space that is used by a ton of people. The way the rabbis describe it is 600,000 people cross it every day, which, by the way, there's very few of those spaces, maybe like Times Square. So it's not just that it's something that nobody owns, but it's also area that in which a lot of people use. So that is really what a public domain is. And so you would imagine then, because that's a really high number that a lot of people use, there would be a lot of spaces in between those two categories, right? Between Reshut Yachid and Reshut HaRabim. For example, what about a national park? Right? You're on a hiking trail somewhere, right? You're walking through the forest. It's not that 600,000 people, it's not this thoroughfare that a bunch of people use to cross it all the time, right? It's not like there's a ton of people there, yet it's not fenced in property. So the rabbis came up with, in the end, according to the Torah, this would be, well, it has, we don't really know, or you're certainly not breaking a Torah violation of transitioning or taking one object from the other. So the rabbis basically created this sort of middle territory that they called a Carmelite. Right, you know, it's a Greek word. That's why it sounds a little weird. A Carmelite, and a Carmelite is a rabbinic area that's sort of between the two, right? So it's really any territory that's big enough to be a Reshut Yachid, that's big enough to be a private domain, but is not fenced in, right? It's not fenced in anywhere. And so therefore it's called a Carmelite. And so what the rabbis did is they said, rabbinically, you are forbidden to carry an object from Reshut Yachid into a Carmelite, right? From a private domain into a Carmelite, or from a public domain into a Carmelite, right? Now, why did they do that? Again, what's our logic? Why do rabbis make this growth and decrees in general?
To prevent you from violating.
Right. To prevent you from violating, because if they didn't do that, you might have said, well, okay, this is probably a Carmelite, doesn't really matter. Or maybe it's probably true that 600,000 people don't walk this every day. Doesn't seem like there's a lot of people around. Okay, I'm going to take the cup. And meanwhile, you didn't know that actually it is a Reshut HaRabim. So to prevent people from doing that, they made all these other areas also places where you can't carry, right? And so most of the times when we break carrying law, by the way, or when we're in danger of breaking carrying law, it is a breaking of rabbinic authority, right? Because most of the places that are outside of our house are Carmelites today. Why? We don't have 600,000 people walking outside of our house every day. Yes, it's a public street, but we don't have 600,000. I mean, maybe if you live in New York City, right? Although New York City has an Eruv around the whole entire city, right? But there are actually most scholars say there are actually very, very few places today that actually their real Reshut HaRabim exist. So for that matter, most of the prohibition of carrying on Shabbat, what we're really worried is rabbinic violations, right? That's really the reason we don't carry out on Shabbat anymore. Like in our neighborhood, there are no Reshut HaRabim. It's just there's Reshut Yachid in your house and a Carmelite out in the street, right? So I think for those of us who really are really worried about carrying on Shabbat and are trying to observe, and we're not at the point yet where we're not carrying on Shabbat, maybe this should make us feel a little better. Okay, this is a room where we can be a little flexible. It's a rabbinic violation. We should strive, obviously, to follow that as well. But if you're thinking of your observance and steps of trying to become more observant, carrying should probably be the last thing that you're worried about. Because again, it's a rabbinic fence, and there really isn't so many Reshut HaRabim. We'd also consider this as well in case someone is having a health issue, or even if it's a non-lethal health issue, or the congregation needs something on Shabbat and it's located in a different house, I might be willing to say as the rabbi, because this is a rabbinic fence, I'm willing to break this rabbinic law because there's a tzorach rabbin, or there's a great need of the whole entire community for a particular matter. For example, if I forgot a book in my sermon, and I realized before my sermon, I need this book, otherwise I can't give a sermon, I might be willing to say, okay, I'm going to go back to my house and get that book, even though I don't usually carry, because there's this great need for this book by the community, so therefore I'm going to bring it, right? So very, very important. Makes sense so far? Do we understand what a Carmelite is now? Do we get it? So what are the sages now going to ask? What about a Carmelite? right? So now take our case, take our water case, right, where the person is standing inside a Reshut Yechid and leans over. Can they lean over just their head, right, and drink from a Carmelite? Is there enough worry that the rabbis are worried that the person is going to bring a vessel from a Carmelite into a Reshut Yechid? Now, what's the problem with this? If we said yes, right, that because of this we shouldn't be able to drink like this if you're standing on Reshut Yechid leading into a Carmelite, right? They said yes, the rabbis make a decree. And what would be the problem of this according to Rabbah, according to what we have talked about before?
A decree upon a decree.
Bingo. It's another case of a decree upon a decree, right? This is a parallel case, right? Because the Carmelite in itself, transferring an object from one domain from a Carmelite to a Reshut Yechid is only a rabbinic violation anyway. And then, since you're not even meaning to do that in the first place, and the rabbis are making an extra fence and saying you can't even lean over because you might bring the cup in. That's another fence the rabbis are making. So here, what the rabbis find here is a pretty good parallel case to our Mishnah, right? Make sense so far? So that's why they're asking about this. That's why they're asking about the Carmelite. So there's going to be a machloket in the end about disagreement. So what is the time? What is the time right now? I don't want to go.
10:45.
10:45. Okay, good. We have more time. Good. We can keep going. So there's going to be a dilemma. There's going to be a disagreement about what to do about this. And it's going to be a disagreement between Abaye and Rava. And this is the source of where the Tosfot that we learned before gets this idea that Rava disagrees with making a gezerah upon a gezerah, a decree upon a decree. So the Gemara says, what is the legal status of a Carmelite in this matter? So Abaye is the first Amora who's going to be brought up. Amar Abaye, he just says in the Gemara. It is the same, right? It is, right? Literally. It's just the same, meaning the same rule applies, right? Meaning, what does this say about Abaye? What does this say about Abaye?
You treat the Carmelite the same as you would treat a public domain.
Right? So therefore,
you can.
Does Abaye say that this is okay?
No.
So Abaye then would say it is not permitted, right, to lean over when you're standing in a Reshut Yechid and drink from a Reshut, from a Carmelite, as if you bring your whole entire, if you only put your head into that domain, according to the Mishnah itself that they brought up, right? So that's Abaye. And I think in a larger sense, beyond this particular case, what is Abaye saying about making gezerah upon a gezerah or a decree upon a decree? Is that permitted? Is that okay for Abaye, or is that not okay?
It's okay.
It's okay.
He's doing
Good.
it.
Thank you, Beth. Right? Exactly. Right. So it seems to be okay. Abaye seems to believe that the rabbinic authority extends beyond this first level of decree, but that the rabbis actually have this extra authority to be able to make a decree on a decree. So Abaye seems to be a little bit more flexible here. Rava is going to disagree with them. So Rava and Abaye, by the way, are always disagreeing. They're what we call in Aramaic bar plukta, right? They're people who argue all the time, right? So usually if you find the opinion of an Abaye, you'll usually find the opinion of Rava next, and they kind of always argued with each other. They were best friends, of course, but they always argued. So Rava had a different opinion. Rava Amar, Ki Gufa Gezerah. This itself is a Gezerah, right? Meaning Gufa literally means body, right? The body of this itself is actually a Gezerah, meaning the idea of not being able to transfer between a Reshut Yechid and a Carmelite, between a private domain and this middle territory or a Carmelite, is only a rabbinic violation anyway. Va'anan nekum v'nigzor gezerah. Sorry, the video is blocking. Legezerah, right? And if it was prohibited to carry from, if we made this prohibited that one can't stand and put his head to drink when he's into a Carmelite to drink when he's standing in Reshut Yechid. If we made that gezerah, we'd be then making a gezerah upon a gezerah. And obviously, according to Rabbah, he has this understanding that we can't do this, right? Are we really allowed to do this? And obviously, it's an implicit question of, no, we're not allowed to do this. right? So Rabbah, therefore, has a more stringent idea of where rabbinic authority lies, right? A much more conservative opinion of how far rabbis can stretch their authority, while Abaye's a little bit more liberal on rabbinic power. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's important that we understand the micro discussion, that we're really talking about, can you drink from a Rishut Rabim into a Carmelit, and understand the details of this micro halakhic discussion, but to understand that from that micro discussion, they're talking about much bigger values, right? Of actually, how far does rabbinic authority go? Okay, and there seems to be an Amoraic disagreement. And the Gemara is going to try to parse out what are the stakes of this Amoraic machloket further on in the Gemara. Make sense so
Rabbi?
far? Yes.
Yeah. I got a question. So generally speaking, with the rabbinic authority, it to grant ketters or leniencies by the rabbi, that the leniencies from away from rabbinic fences to the Torah would be more likely to happen than extra stringencies added to the rabbinic fences to the Torah.
Yeah, the rabbis actually have no authority to make leniencies, right? Because a leniency, right?
Okay.
An extra Torah leniency would be, okay, the Torah is saying you can't do this, but the rabbis are saying you can. Now, there are really strange cases in the Gemara where we bump into that, and those are big arguments in themselves. But for the most part, 99.999% of the time, the rabbis can't do this, right? This is against the rules. Think of it: the rabbis can only, color inside the lines here, right? They can't abrogate something that the Torah says is forbidden. They can't say it's permitted, right? They only can say something's forbidden that the Torah says is permitted, right? Makes sense so far?
Yes. What about with leniencies towards a rabbinic fence around the Torah? So like it's not the Torah violation, but it's something that the rabbis are putting there as a precaution so that you don't violate the Torah. Is it still coloring within the lines, like they won't move on that?
As I said before, we can make leniencies with rabbinic rulings. I mean, that's where rabbis really come in, right? That's where my rabbis. I do those things all the time. By the way, that's one way. For example, the conservative movement allowed people to drive on Shabbat, right? Driving, according to most understandings, is you by driving you violate many different biblical prohibitions in Shabbat. But usually, what people are most concerned about is kivui and light lahadlik ner and lighting a fire or extinguishing a fire, right? Because when we turn on the engine, right, the fire starts and we ignite a flame. So most authorities have always said that combustion is an actual malacha, is actually a Torah category of prohibited labor on Shabbat, right? And therefore, one can't drive a car. But the conservative rabbis in the 60s, right, said actually it's not really the breaking of a Torah law, it's the breaking of a rabbinic law. Now, why? Why did they say that? It's because you're only doing this indirectly. Now, this gets way too complicated not way too complicated, it's somewhat complicated. So I'm not going to go into this in detail, but they basically said that you're only breaking a rabbinic prohibition because you're not meaning to actually ignite a flame inside the car. You're meaning to drive the car, right? But because you drive the car, they said that that the ignition is going to start the car. And, again, I don't necessarily think I agree with the arguments they make, but they basically say that this is a case of a rabbinic prohibition and not a Torah prohibition. Once they're able to make it a rabbinic prohibition and not a Torah prohibition, they're able to say there's this great need, because if people can't drive on Shabbat, they're not going to be able to come to shul, and they're not going to be able to daven, and they're not going to be able to have Jewish community. That's obviously a tzorach rabim, and the sages could have never understood that people live far away from shuls and everything like that, and this would shut down Jewish life completely. They say this in the Tshuva, that they're really afraid that now that Jews have moved out to the suburbs, we're really afraid that synagogues there's going to be no more synagogue. There's going to be no more people davening, and there's going to be many more transgressions. If Jews can't come to shul on holidays or Shabbat, there are going to be many more transgressions that Jews violate anyway. So they basically said, the rabbis of 50 years ago said, we're going to make a leniency. We're going to say that you can break this rabbinic prohibition because we're afraid of this. There's this great need, right? So that's an example of rabbis, modern day rabbis, being lenient about rabbinic prohibitions. I do these things all the time, right? Now, I disagree. I disagree with what they did, but regardless, I do these things all the time, right? This is why you need a rabbi, because obviously, this can get out of hand very quickly. So you have to be very, very careful about which times you're lenient and which times you're not lenient on behalf of the community, right? This can be abused very quickly. Okay, I don't know why my screen stopped sharing. You guys don't see the text anymore, right?
Right.
Weird. Hold on a second. Stop sharing my screen. I'm going to share again. I don't know why that happened. Sorry about this, everyone. Keep going in a second. All right. All right, we're back. Okay. So that's where we are right now. Okay, we have 5 minutes left. Let's see what we can get through. So to continue on, what the rabbis are next going to do is to try to really understand what is the narrative of Abaye and Rav. Maybe it's best that we save this for next time. The Gemara is going to go into why does Abaye, what is the proof that Abaye has in saying this, and what is the proof that Rabbah has in saying this. But I think that we can understand from this, and what we gain from this is an understanding, of course, of what is the limit of rabbinic authority, what does Judaism care about really, what should we be concerned about? And I think, for me, at least in this discussion, I don't know what you're thinking about, my kind of meta understanding of this is sort of this punctilious concern for the rabbis about what should rabbis be concerned about. Really, what should they, where do they draw the line of where rabbinic concern is? And what should we be really focused on? And that, of course, is the laws of the Torah itself, right? Making sure that the laws of the Torah are followed, right? And to make sure that Judaism is applicable, that it is doable, that is something that one can actually do in the end. And of course, they're worried. They're very worried here. At least Rabbah seems to be worried, not Abaye, about rabbis sort of misusing their authority to say and do things that would be not under the purview of the Torah. And I think this is a great way for rabbis, great text for rabbis to look at. Right? I keep stopping to share, but regardless, we're done anyway. This is a great text for rabbis to look at, to remain humble and to understand where our authority lies, number one. And number two, I think it's really important for Jews to also understand that when we say something is permitted or not permitted, it's not like, I can't tell you how many times people are like, can't you just make it kosher? Right? Can't you just give people a permission to do something? Rabbis don't have the authority to do that, right? We don't actually, if the Torah forbids something, we don't have the authority to permit it. We can't just say, oh, I know better, right? So I think that's really important to understand. We'll continue this learning next week, Thursday at 10 a.m. I hope we enjoyed this. Please feel free to ask any questions or comments. You can email me at Rabbi Marcus Rubenstein, templeofaaron.org. Yeah, last question.
Question is, this happened to me where I put my jacket on, I was walking outside, I get to Carmelite, and I realized I had something in my pocket.
Mm-hmm.
So then what are you supposed to do?
Yeah, so I would say, because it's a Carmelite and you might bump into Reshut Rabim, I would say to you, go back to your house and put away your things, right? Because you might end up in a Reshut Rabim. And obviously, if you're going to keep walking, then you're going to violate that more. So I would just, if it's a short way, I would go back to your house. If you really want to be very, very careful, I would just put the object on the ground and keep walking, right? But again, if it's an item that's very expensive or you can't do that, I wouldn't do that. But again, that's a great time. That's why it's so important. Look, as a rabbi, I might say to you, what's forbidden is forbidden, right? And you as a lay Jew might say, oh, well, I have I brought my iPhone in my pocket. And so you might say, oh my God, I'm doing something forbidden. I'm breaking Shabbos. So therefore, I'm just going to throw my iPhone on the street and walk away. Look how pious I am. And I would say to you, no, you're being ridiculous. That's why you need to know the origin of where halacha comes from, because if you're a knowledgeable Jew, you would then be able to say, well, I'm only breaking a rabbinic prohibition anyway. And then you give yourself the room to say, okay, there's this really great need right here. I'm going to lose a ton of money, $1,000 to buy a new iPhone. I'm going to bring it back in. Right? And that's why it's so important not just to know what's forbidden and not forbidden and permitted, but to understand where the law comes from. Right? So that we can make leniencies and make Judaism livable. Does that make sense? Wonderful. All right. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate this. Until next time, we'll talk soon, everybody. Bye now.
Thank you.